to our book talk this afternoon, The Moses Virus with Jack Hyland. I'm happy that this is the first book talk of the spring semester and wish to congratulate Mr. Hyland on his new publication, which is certainly a departure from other writing. Happy to investigate a few library holdings of the Moses Virus. Discovered that this book is already held in 33 libraries across the world, even though it has only been on the market for 20 days. So officially came out on January 7th. So I would like to introduce Professor Leichter, who will then be introducing Jack Hyland, and we will get started. So, Hope Leichter is Ebenwood Professor of Education, has worked here at TC for many, many years, and served on numerous committees. Her interests include family and communities as educators, family memories and narratives, kinship networks and grandparents as educators, the mediation of television by the family, education in community settings, museums and libraries, as well as families and school reform, immigration, migration, and family education. So with no further ado, I will get started.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's an honor to be here and to be given the privilege of introducing Jack Hyland, the author of The Moses Virus. And I have to give special thanks to Jennifer Govan, and I would like to nominate you as the Forensic Librarian of the Year because you found out and asked me to do the introduction because you found out that Jack's previous book, which is also displayed, Evangelism's First Modern Media Star, Jack's Bill Stidger, was on the reading list for my course on the family as educator. And in fact, it's on the reading list because we have known each other on various committees, and long story short, when your book came out, I thought it would be very, very helpful to have for students in the class looking at family education and looking at, among other things, grandparents as educators and how ideas are or are not transmitted from one generation to another. And so I asked you to come and talk about your book, how you wrote it, to students in the class. And I must say, at the point in which you've come, and you've done it several times, I've been very grateful. And so the students are preparing to write their projects. And it's been a wonderful help for them to see somebody who actually did it, took a watch, actually got a biography of your grandfather done. And so I, again, thank Jennifer for discovering that your book was on my reading list, and I intend to keep it there, and I hope you will continue coming to the class. I now have to say that I have the task of introducing a man of many talents and many hats. You are co-chair of our trustees, and with all due respect, that's a very important role, but it's only one of the many roles you've had. You are founding partner of Media Advisory Partners, more or less right? Mm-hmm. You are someone who was, among other things, an undergraduate physics major, who's also a trustee of Art Institute, Clark Art Institute. So you've got this range of talents, and you are trustee emeritus of the American Academy in Rome, which is particularly intriguing in terms of the coming book. Now this is quite amazing. When you come to my class on the family as educator, I make a big point that I'm introducing you, with all due respect, as not a trustee, although we know that, but as a grandson who's written a biography of his grandfather. What am I to do now? I can introduce you as a Renaissance man person. That would be too dated. I thought I could perhaps introduce you as a 21st century globally creative intellect, which I think you really are with all these many hats and talents. But Then I have the issue of how do you introduce someone who's written a thriller? And I have to say, I was quite carried away. I don't have the opportunity to read many thrillers. I'm busy, as many of us are, with dissertations, with term papers, with social science literature, with new policy issues, and to read a thriller is quite something else. I have some things to say about the educational significance, but for the moment, I just want to say that reading it was a really new experience for me, because I found myself so carried away, so engrossed, that I really did. This is really true. I lost track of time and space, and I even thought I might be under the influence of a virus. So on that note, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
That's extremely nice to hear.
It's really true. I don't know about the virus part, but...
Well, yeah, I did want to say that if you have any questions, I am wide open and willing to talk about them and give you whatever answers I feel like giving you. But making a strong effort not to give the story away. But I would like to start giving you a little bit of a background about the book and how it started. And I am very thankful for as many people from as serious an organization as Teachers College willing to think about a thriller. It's gratifying, and it was great fun to write. It took me 8 years to write it. And maybe that's just because I'm not so efficient, but it really was a work that it absorbed me. It was fun, and it was also a work where it changed many times, because one of the things I found about the thriller is that you really have to engage the reader almost continuously, and that's the pledge I believe that a thriller requires. I'd like to think that the book, my biography, was equally thrilling, but I'm prepared to accept the fact that it wasn't. So this was a big, interesting exercise, and the origin comes from my having been chairman of the American Academy in Rome, an institution that's over 100 years old, 120 years old. Sends approximately 25 fellows who win the Rome Prize in the U.S. to its property of 11 acres in Rome on the highest of Rome's hills, the Janiculum Hill. And they come from various disciplines: architecture, art, sculpture, writing, archaeology, scholarly studies. So it's a gamut. And these students, they're generally in their early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, although they're mid-career fellowships, live together for as much as a year, and have no specific assignments other than to imbibe from one of the greatest cities in the world the art, the architecture, and the history. Because everywhere you look, it's at least 2,000 years old. So one day I was invited to go to the Roman Forum, sort of the center of Rome historically, and in that watch a team of archaeologists from the American Academy authorized to dig in the Roman Forum. And I arrived around 6 in the morning. It was a hot June day, and Rome in June can be very hot. Everyone was gathering around. There were probably 35 people. And they were beginning this dig at the beginning of a new season. Archaeology goes in seasons. Everything is put away neatly at the end of the prior season and then begun again when they arrive. Many of them are graduate students aiming to be full-fledged teachers or professors, and it's an honor to dig in the Roman Forum. And what they were looking for, they had discovered an underground passageway at the end of the prior season. And from where it was located, there was a chance that this passageway would lead to Emperor Nero's Golden House, probably the largest building ever built. It actually covered 3 of Rome's 7 hills. When Nero, it was alleged that Nero had set on fire Rome itself, and apparently more than half of Rome burned. This is the famous picture of him playing his violin while Rome burned. And the idea spread around was that he had set the fire himself, had it set, so that he could clear the land to build an unbelievably large building with parks and lakes. He died in around 64 AD, committed suicide, and almost immediately all the succeeding emperors did what they could to stamp out this building. They tore it down, they built upon it, and so quite a lot of it remains unexcavated. And this is what the passageway might have led to. So you picture me there with about 35 young archaeologists eager to learn about archaeology itself. And beginning to, 2 of them were going down into the passageway when they had moved the stone aside. Any of you who have studied archaeology would be amazed to learn that at the turn of the prior century, in the 1880s and 90s, there was the Roman Forum, but it was 25 feet higher than the base of the buildings that now exist there. Many years of decay, floods had occurred, and there was a topsoil throughout the floor of the Roman Forum, and the tool that was used to remove the overburden was dynamite. Today, archaeologists use toothbrushes. So we're talking about a difference in technology and the acceptance of technology. And I was there in this hot, sweltering weather, and the team went down into the passageway. In a sense, the book begins. Imagination, I am sure I got tired of watching the toothbrushes at work. And the idea that begins with this book starts from 2 sudden, unexplained, and horrible deaths which occur when the 2 archaeologists explore the passageway. So that's the beginning of the book. I'd like to tell you just a little bit about underlying themes, which I hope do not get in the way of the page turning, but which did play a role in my thinking about a thriller. And one of those themes is what may have killed those 2 archaeologists, which was a virus. I'll let you discover for yourselves if you read the book, or if you have already read the book, you know the origin of that virus. But there is a model for that virus, which I was aware of. In fact, my grandfather, as a preacher in 1918 and 19 in San Francisco, had been in the presence of the worst virus mankind has ever experienced. It is called the Spanish influenza of 1918-19. It went throughout the world primarily because it followed all of the soldiers from the First World War when the war ended back to their homes. They carried this with them. It was a devastating death. It killed younger people more than it killed older, which was an unusual pattern for a virus. And it killed, without question, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. Viruses tend to run their course. What they do is that they mutate. And the one that mutated from a bird or an animal and became the Spanish virus eventually mutated its way out of our awareness. The deaths ended and the world went on. But within the last 10 years, the Centers for Disease Control, which is located in Atlanta, sponsored the reconstitution of this virus. They felt, and in fact a number of other groups pitched in and helped. They recreated the virus, they successfully recreated it, and it exists today in 10 test tubes under refrigeration in Atlanta. The first press releases by the CDC, as it's called, were triumphant. This was the first time anything like this had ever been reconstituted. And it took a while for the news to leak out, and then the other side of the coin began to be explored. There were a number of people that said, why reconstitute something that killed 50 to 100 million people and leave it in 10 test tubes, any one of which could be stolen, and this thing set off again. They were reconstituted from an Inuit Eskimo woman whose body was in the permafrost and had remained unchanged since she had died from it. So it had not mutated away from its devastating strength. And to me, this is one of the underlying themes. What is the role of both science and of humanity to evaluate whether this is a worthy project to undertake or a devastatingly dangerous one? Theme 1. Theme 2, which also plays a role in the book, stems from a visit that I took to it's called the Bohemian Grove. There's a Bohemian Club in San Francisco, and that once a year in the redwood forests, there's a gathering of world leaders. The politicians, economists, businessmen gather for a 2-week period and talk. A little bit, I would guess, like today, what goes on in Switzerland at this time of year. And leaders when I was there were Henry Kissinger and Giscard d'Estaing and Reagan and other people. I was asked to go. I decided to go. And as it turned out, I had breakfast one morning with the former head of the World Bank, very, very reputable individual, very thoughtful, as well as a famous commentator. And we had breakfast together, and during the course of the breakfast, the former head of the World Bank let us know how disillusioned he had been with some very major problems affecting the world. And that was the growth of hunger and death by starvation. We have 7 billion people in the world today, 1 billion of whom are formally described as undernourished, which is a euphemism for starving. virtually all of them, the billion, live in the third world. There are many reasons why they are starving. And they range from they are living longer if they live. There are more children because the families lose fewer children because of our Western drugs. They want more children so they can scratch at the small amounts of land that they've got to make more food. And the majority of the food that is sent, or the money that is sent to buy the food, is squandered and captured by the politicians in these countries. And there is no reason that there should be starvation. And worse, the situation is increasing. The rate of growth of our population in the world is rising primarily because of growth in the third world. The developed countries are basically about even in terms of replacing their populations. Whose responsibility is it that 1/7 of the world population is both undernourished and starving? Is it those who starve? Is it we who have too much for our own needs? And if it is, how do we overcome the natural barriers that exist that keep the food or the money for the food reaching the people that need it? And I saw this, and this individual who was the head of the World Bank. Now, this is the conversation we had. The conversation wound up by his saying, in a very disillusioned way, he had reached the point where no matter what he did in his role at the World Bank, he was unable to break this cycle. The institution was unable to break it. He had reached the conclusion that probably the world needed a major scourge, a plague or a virus, to wipe out the problems that couldn't be solved in any other way. The guy I was sitting with, who was the commentator, was Walter Cronkite. We didn't say anything when he said this, but when we left the breakfast, Walter said, "Did you hear what I heard?" And he's such a responsible individual. He is so well respected, and yet he has arrived at an absolutely horrifying possibility as the only solution he saw. So you will see in this book that there is this underlying idea and that there is an involvement, and I hope in no way does it stop anybody from enjoying the rest of it. So I won't belabor any more about the book because I don't want to spoil any of it. But I would be very happy to answer any question you've got about either how to write, where to write, what it's about, or questions you might have. And I'll do what I can to answer them.
May I have the privilege, thank you for this very engaging preamble to the book. May I have the privilege of asking the first question, which is, in a way, the flip side of a question that I've asked you in the Families Educator class, and that is, what's the difference between writing a biography and writing a thriller?
Well, I had to work really hard on the biography. And I learned pretty quickly that every fact, every sentence has got to ring true. And that was work. So I said to myself, I think I'll try a fiction because I can make it up. And what I discovered is it's harder than a biography because you do have to make it up, but every sentence has to read just as truly. So I think what I like about the thriller is that I took characters I knew and fit them into a set of circumstances and let them help me work on the book together. And I became so engaged with them that it was quite an exciting thing to write the thriller. So there is that side of it, which I found a wonderful experience.
I happen to think it's very educational. I'd like to go into that at some point during the discussion, but I'm sure I don't want to preempt others from asking questions. I'm sure there are lots of other people who have
I
questions.
have a question. This is a question from a relentlessly empirical historian. So when you watch the descent of those two archaeologists down into that passageway, and this book was born in your imagination, did they die? Or was that something that you imagined?
I will answer that. They did not die. In fact, I used the senior archaeologist's name until the end when I then changed most of the names. And I had to tell him he was killed off early. He laughed. Yes?
I'm Karen Sendler, and I now work for President Furman in Development and External Affairs, but I am a trained archaeologist. That was my first career. So I read this over the weekend in a very excited fashion. How did you sort of master archaeology enough or just enough to lure people in, including me? Because by the end, I was ready to get on a plane and go to Rome and go to Greece and get my toothbrush and pickaxe and go back to work.
I did homework on it with some archaeologists. And what had happened from the time I actually initially experienced that incident, technology changed even more. And so I needed help in getting up-to-date technology into it. And I was really worried about getting it wrong. So I'm very pleased that you're not screaming.
Actually, the one point at which I screamed, you just took care of. It was about and I won't ruin it for anyone who's here, but the head of Biography, when you find out what his goal is, it made me really angry. And I wanted to know why you chose to have him do that, but you just answered that. That makes me scared.
I better not answer that.
I asked you earlier a lot of questions about what was true and what wasn't, but I can't ask now because I would give away the book. But it's obvious that you've spent a lot of time in Rome. Is everything about the streets, the restaurants, is that all true and part of your experience?
I've had 14 reviews, and then one that have all been good,
Yeah.
4 and 5 stars, and one lousy one, who thought this book really should be bought only as a remainder. And the writer comes from Waco, Texas, which Gary suggested was maybe a good thing because it says that somebody's reading, at least in Texas. Maybe you didn't want that attributed to you.
It's okay.
It's very hard to. I went around very carefully. I had read Dan Brown's 2 of his books, and I'd found flaws in them.
Yeah.
And that really irritated me. And I think you have a covenant with the reader that if you take them to a restaurant or up the Spanish Steps, there ought to be some veracity to it. And it should be checkable. And that to me, was a very critical part. And so I spent 2 weeks a summer ago confirming what I had written, a lot of it from memory or from notes, to make as certain as possible that if you go to that place, it'll be the way it's described. And I think that's part of the fun of reading these.
Yeah.
And the part in the Vatican, which all happened.
You did get to a private part of the...
Yes.
So I think that's so important. I can remember throwing out a novel that I was really into because the person had Fifth Avenue being two-way street. I mean, recently. I'm not reading this anymore.
I think it's a bummer when you run that. Exactly.
Does this mean you keep notes all the time when you're?
I do take notes. It's part of, I have always done writing. And I found there's one character, in fact, the bad guy, I won't even describe, I will leave him described that way. On a business trip I took a number of years ago to Germany, I met him.
Yeah.
And I'd been so interested in his character that I actually wrote down some elements of it. And so he becomes and the detail, when you run across somebody interesting, if you do write about them, then years later, if you ever were to want to use them, it's the details that give them all the life. And you forget the details. And so he exists as a mad, evil person, but the details of everything else were as I remembered them. Gary.
So I was going to ask you about the characters and sort of drawing the characters in general, and the question I had was, you know, are they composites, or are they modeled after sort of, you know, one key person, or are they totally constructed, or are they some of each?
Mostly, I think they are. The fundamental is a person that I have very clearly in mind. And I will add attributes to prove a point. And in fact, this book, the biography, which is the story of my grandfather, he was a leading preacher. Sinclair Lewis had decided he was going to write a book about the ministry. He asked to visit my grandparents, where he lived with them for a month and around them for 6 months. And then he wrote Elmer Gantry. Now, my grandfather was an author himself, and in his life published 52 books. He was also an exaggerator. And so he told everybody that not only had he persuaded the greatest writer of the 20th century to write a book on the ministry, he was going to be the model for it. And when Sinclair Lewis wrote and published Elmer Gantry, they had a huge fight.
Yeah.
My grandfather forgot about why he should not be surprised. And Sinclair Lewis said, the only reason you're screaming at me is because it fills your churches. So the point of it is, though, that Sinclair Lewis later summarized what he was trying to do, and that is that he had become alarmed at the rise of fundamentalism. The Scopes trial had recently been decided, and so he was out to get organized religion in order to stop fundamentalism from it going all the way to the White House, which he thought could well be a possibility. And so what he admits he did is he used my grandfather's charisma, to which he added another minister's being an alcoholic, although it was probably more Sinclair Lewis describing himself in that way, a womanizer, a cynic, and a fundamentalist. He picked up other attributes. So he was taking a character and then embellishing it with characteristics that made sense. And that really did happen. I'm guilty too.
So as a follow-up to Gary's question, do any of the people who imagine themselves as role models, have any of them contacted you? And
No, I'm worried about one of them.
Oh.
That's my fantasy, waking up at 3 and, did you really do this? Yeah.
You mentioned before that your characters sort of that you became very involved with the characters individually, even though they came from somewhere else. And I've often read about, the experience of writing where the characters take over the book or take over a part of it and lead the story. So I wondered if that was your experience. Did you find that was?
I think it is my experience. I always read that Alfred Hitchcock planned every single shot in a movie. He was one of you could describe as a control freak. And the alternative is to establish your characters with a general idea of what's going to happen. And there are definitely things that happen differently because of the way in which they interact. And it isn't all I don't think it's actually all the author working. I think it has a lot to do with the characteristics and making those people act the way they are going to act anyway.
What's next? What's your next book?
This book ends in an amusing way, and it commits me to a sequel. And let me just read you that. And I imagine you will agree that that's where it's going. Alex is the girl who is, and I should say that the hero, Tom Stewart, is an everyman. He has no unusual talents that arrive at this. He happens to be a witness to the deaths, and very soon finds himself hounded by people who realize that there was a dangerous virus and want that virus for their own purposes. He is aided by a very attractive Italian-American woman named Alex, and they have to battle both finding out what that virus is, where it was hidden, and how to destroy it before they in turn are tracked down and made to, they're essentially imperiled. So at the end of this, so Alex pulled slightly away from Tom and said, "Mr. Forensic Archaeologist, tell me exactly what was in Crystal's small leather case when she drove away from Kronberg Castle." Tom said, "I have no bloody idea, and perhaps it's better that neither of us know." "Fine by me," said Alex. And that is the way things stood for quite a while. But in exactly 1 year and 3 months, Tom would have the exact answer to Alex's question. So I either have to throw this book away or finish it. Gary?
So that leads me to this question that I was left with at the end of the book, and I'll ask it without giving anything away. But I could see the next book being about Tom, but I could just as easily see the next book being about Crystal. And the thing going in a very different kind of direction, because in some ways she, to me, was the most perplexing character, and in some ways the one I was able to least predict what was going to happen next.
Crystal is a completely puzzling character, extraordinarily intelligent, very beautiful, very powerful, and with no moral, underneath it, I don't think, any pure moral direction. I mean, she is practical beyond comprehension and able to get what her way is. I think she could play a very important role and probably will. And she's such a fascinating character, and she'll probably have a fight with Alex before we get done.
And you'll let us know when she calls you at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
Yes.
I must say, on the speculative side, I found myself wondering whether there would be a sequel about Teachers College. Either presumably or under
Watch out.
passages.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the process publishing a novel, working on publishing a novel as opposed to maybe doing an academic book or biography?
Sure. And time, it makes a big difference too, because when I published this book, the biography, it's 10 or 11 years ago, that was when the publishing industry was pretty much the way we all knew it, and it existed that way for years. What's dramatically changed is that there's now Amazon, which is, without question, an amazingly powerful presence in publishing and in many other areas. They're more efficient. They drive the publishers completely nuts because they dictate terms. But that's one thing that's different. The other is that there are now bloggers. In the last 10 years, there has been a decline in the small bookstore, which can't compete with Amazon, and there has been the rise of the bloggers. And there is still a highly significant role in radio and television in getting the word out. Yes, there are efforts made to have a book party or anything like that. They don't sell a lot of books. And if you look at the ability to reach a large number of people, blogging is one way, i.e. the internet, radio and television, magazines. But the number of books that are reviewed by, for example, the New York Times in relationship to the number of books published is infinitesimal. So getting in is very difficult. And now self-publishing has become something which is excuse me, easy to do, relatively inexpensive, so that there's so many changes that the way in which you still have to find someone to champion a book, whether it's a biography or a thriller. What I'm finding is that most of the bloggers that have been interested in the Moses fires have been women so far. I would not have guessed that, but there have been far more bloggers who are women. It may say that there are more women readers than men readers. Certainly romance novels are 80% read by women. I don't know about thrillers. I would have guessed there would have been 50-50 or even more men than women, but it has not seemed to be the case. But you have to use the new channels in order to get them across. Publishers still have an impossible job, because if you are a well-known writer, they will give you an advance. Of course, I did not get an advance. And so they are exposed in that regard, and they distribute to places like Amazon and the small bookstores. And if the books are not sold, they come right back to the publisher, and so it's a terrible business model. And Amazon discounts the books dramatically, which drags everything down. And the other thing is, when you give books out for reviewers to review and bloggers to review, 90% of them show up as secondhand sales even before the book is published. So that you will see, if you go to Amazon, you'll see different prices, and no one, the book, they were already quoting secondhand sales before the book was formally published. So, I mean, it's a very different world. Yeah.
Jack, at any point in writing this book, did you get to a point where you said, oh, this is too much? This is really much more about the writing process, where you say, I'm at a dead end here, I can't go any further. And if so, how did you come out of it? I mean, How did you move past that? There's a lot, a lot of writers in the room in different ways. I think would be interested in hearing about that process.
Well, there were similar examples in this book, but in the biography I wrote, my mother had written a book that was not published about her life as the daughter of a famous preacher. And I found that I could use some of the work that she took a trip with her father during the Depression, and on the boat back, she falls in love with my father. And this entire romance is kept from my grandfather. The one instruction that my grandmother had given him on taking their daughter to Europe was, I don't want her coming back married. He, of course, is blissfully unaware that this has happened. And this happens to be a wonderful sequence. And I made it a separate chapter. I used a lot of what she had written, but I enlarged upon it, and it was my favorite chapter in the book. And one day I was meeting with my editor, and she always arrived with a huge, thick stack of paper filled with Post-its of different colors. And she said, you know, Jack, this chapter with your mother in it is my favorite chapter. I said, yes, it's mine too. And she said, it's well written, the story is fascinating. I said, yeah. And she said, but it has to go. And I said, how can you tell me that? And she said, because your grandfather is not at the center of it, and it stops all the momentum of the book. She said, I hope you can find another place for it, but you've got to take it out. And that set me back emotionally, psychologically. And then I began to realize that that was a very great piece of dialogue, and she was right. And you just have to work your way through these things, or give up. And there's always a solution, but it takes a while to get to it. And there were a number of occasions when the Moses Fires changed direction, and the editor said, now, why don't you do this? And I thought to myself, that's so easy to say to me. You don't know what that means. But by and large, if an editor means someone who has really got your best interest at heart, I've found that no matter how horrible it is, it's usually a good thing that they say. And it ain't easy.
Yeah. And like you said, there's always a solution. You just have to find it.
Yeah.
So that's great. Good advice.
I'd like to ask a question about the educational use of this kind of writing in schools and for younger people. I found myself so engaged and so taken by how different it was to read a thriller as compared with other kinds of reading. And I'm wondering if there isn't a possibility for students in schools, even fairly young students, to read more thrillers and even try to write them. Especially, for example, in relation to math, science, and technology. They have to do a lot of research to be able to create a thriller. What do you think? Does this have I mean, we are in a school of education, so we have to have serious educational significance. But I really think it may be that this is a possibility we don't emphasize enough.
It is much more entertaining. I remember a physics book I had that I'd read, and then I'd realize I hadn't remembered a single bloody thing. I have to read it again and again. And when telling you what I think are some of the issues in the book that are broader issues that are contained in between the story itself, the lines, I think they can be very instructive, and I think that the movie industry, the thriller, that is entertainment, but it can be serious entertainment. And that's the whole issue, I think, is having something to say, but not necessarily just hitting people over the head with it. Yeah, okay.
You kind of just set up a perfect segue for a question I wasn't sure if I wanted to ask or not, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So sometimes when I'm reading a novel, if it hasn't already been made into a movie, I like to just envision the characters as actual actors to help me see and visualize the characters better. If by some fortune Moses Fires is picked up by movie studio, who do you see playing your lead cast? Like Tom, Crystal, all of them.
I have a couple of names. There is, how many people, I think Alex could be perfectly played by Eva Green. If you've seen Casino Royale, she is devastatingly attractive, intelligent, Italian-American. She's actually French, but I think that would work. And I've had, Cary Grant is no longer available.
George Clooney, right?
George Clooney would be great at it, absolutely. I thought also of Clive Owen, who is. So I think there are, and I've thought about them. Crystal, I don't have yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.